Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining me for this latest APPG on the environment session on biodiversity, and particularly UK biodiversity. We hope to do something on international and global biodiversity later. There's been a lot of increasing evidence over the years that the biodiversity in the UK has been plummeting over the last few decades, in fact, and the number of species, a range of different species, has been falling dramatically. I mean, from hedgehogs to swallows and a whole range of other ones. I mean, it's so visible. I was actually driving, I remember driving with my father, who's 85 years old, in Cambridgeshire over the summer, and he was just saying, it's just extraordinary how there's no insects on the windscreens of the car anymore, whereas 30 years ago, if you drove in the summer, you'd get the windscreen covered with insects. And clearly, the government is doing a lot on this. There is the like the agriculture bill, which is replacing CAP with the environmental land management scheme. There's the environment bill. I'm on the environment bill committee, which has got things like targets for biodiversity, biodiversity net gain in development, environmental improvement plans. There's the 10-point plan, which the government announced today. We arranged this before we knew he was going to announce it, so it's a bit of a coincidence, but it's obviously that's mainly focused on climate change. But one of them in there is about the sort of reconfirmation of the commitment to planting 30,000 hectares, I think it is, of trees a year, and 30% of protected land by 2030. But is this enough? What more needs to be done? What's actually causing this decline in biodiversity? How can we reverse it? And I'm delighted to have a panel here of some of the main conservation groups. We've got Kate Jennings, who's the author of the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds report on Lost Decade, which has been charting the decline of biodiversity in the UK. Delighted we've got Darren Moorcroft, who's the Chief Executive of the Woodland Trust, and then Rob Cathcart, who's Principal Advisor on Biodiversity for Natural England, who provides a lot of advice indeed to DEFRA on their biodiversity strategy. I've asked them all to speak for 5 minutes. The normal rules apply, so if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. We'll also want to get to Q&A as quickly as possible. Please put any questions you have in the chat, or indeed just say you want to ask a question if you want to do it orally, or you can write out the question if you want me to ask it. And you can wave your hands, but I can't guarantee I'll see everyone waving their hands because there's more than one screen of speakers. And we're due to finish at 12 o'clock, which is actually PMQs today, the first time that the Prime Minister has done it virtually. And I need to go and watch that. So anyway, thank you very much for coming. Delighted to that you're all here. I'm going to start with Kate Jennings then of the RSPB about a Lost Decade report. Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to share my screen. What could possibly go wrong? There we go. There, is that working?
Yep.
Fantastic. Yeah, so good morning, everybody. I'm Kate. I'm the Head of Sites and Species Policy at the RSPB, and I've been asked to talk to you a bit about our Lost Decade for Nature report. Let me try and make this move on. Ah, there we go, that's better. So, as Parliament has acknowledged, we are in the midst of both a nature and a climate emergency, two critical and intimately linked existential threats to life on Earth. In the run-up to the global conferences on biodiversity and on climate change, the UK clearly has an opportunity to lead the world on action to address both of those. And in 2021, the UK will not only host the climate conference in Glasgow, which has nature as its theme, but will also be chairing the G7. However, in order to lead with credibility on the global stage, the UK needs to show that it can deliver at home. And here it's got a problem. The last decade was the decade in which the world committed to save nature. In 2010, states across the world signed up to global targets to halt the disastrous loss of biodiversity by 2020, the so-called Aichi targets. However, when the Convention on Biological Diversity published the final global stocktake of performance against those targets, it confirmed that the world had failed to fully achieve any of them. In advance of that report, the RSPB published its own assessment of the UK's performance against those global targets. The UK's own assessment reported that the UK had failed in its contribution to 14 of the 20 targets, but our analysis, based exclusively on the government's own data, shows that the reality is worse than that. We compared our findings to those reported by government, And we focused in particular on the 3 key targets that we believe are the most crucial to efforts to save nature and which offer particularly useful lessons for the decade to come. These are progress on protected areas, species conservation, and funding for nature. On both land and sea, the UK reported that it had exceeded targets to protect 17% of our land and 10% of our seas. And yet, when you look at the data, only around 10% of UK land is actually protected for nature, and only around half of that is in good condition, so more like 5%. At sea, we've made real progress on site designation, but assessment by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee shows that management measures have only been implemented in 10% of those sites, and only 13% have full monitoring in place. For both species and funding, the UK reported that it had not met, but had made progress towards meeting the targets. Yet the State of Nature report makes it clear that species declines have continued unabated, and public sector funding over the last decade for nature has fallen by 29%. So in both of those cases, the only movement has been in the wrong direction. Now, the Prime Minister has signalled the UK's intention to be a world leader on nature and climate, including his really welcome endorsement of the Leaders' Pledge for Nature at the recent UN General Assembly. And there was last week's massively welcome announcement of UK government support for the government of Tristan da Cunha's decision to create a massive new marine protected area in their waters. And that shows the scale of ambition in the UK overseas territories. But at home, as the Lost Decade report shows, there's a massive gap between rhetoric and reality. This was further highlighted by recent work by the Natural History Museum to calculate the Biodiversity Intactness Index of world states. This showed that the UK is at the bottom of the pile for the G7 countries in terms of the fraction of our biodiversity that we have left, and it comes third from the bottom when compared to EU states. So we'll be chairing the G7, talking about biodiversity, and of the G7, we're the worst. So what needs to bridge the gap, and how do we avoid another lost decade? Ambitious global targets must be delivered and must be matched with binding domestic targets. The Environment Bill may help us there in England. And those will only deliver if they're accompanied by robust and transparent accountability frameworks, something we haven't had to date at either global or national level. Interim targets are also essential. Each and every government must deliver. Those commitments must be backed up by action and resources, and we need to grasp the detail behind the deadlines. So, for example, more national parks and AOMBs won't help unless national parks and AOMBs are required, empowered, resourced and held accountable for nature's recovery. At the moment, they're not. We need fundamental reform of agriculture, food production and consumption policies to address the UK's impacts on nature at home and abroad. And finally, we need to realise the massive synergies between action on nature and climate. So nature-based solutions are key. So I'll end with an example of that. In the UK, 76% of our peatlands are degraded. That's terrible for nature and it's terrible for climate. And it's resulting in the release of carbon equivalent to 5% of total UK greenhouse gas emissions every year. Left in that state, those degraded peatlands will emit twice as much carbon as tree planting would capture if the Committee on Climate Change's UK forestry target aims are met. But if we restored our peatlands and our other important habitats, that would throw that into reverse. It would lock away 14 million tonnes of carbon a year. That's equivalent to a third of our total annual agricultural emissions, as well as driving nature's recovery. That's less carbon, more curlews, what's not to like? So to end, when it comes to nature and the climate crises, the problems are clear, the solutions are complementary, and we really don't have another decade to waste. And a curlew to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate, for that rather slightly depressing presentation. But you made the points extremely well. So coming to Darren Moorcroft now from the Woodland Trust. I've been a supporter of the Woodland Trust for quite a long time, and there are actually quite a lot of trees being planted at the moment, aren't they? But maybe not the right ones. Darren, tell me about your perspective on biodiversity loss in the UK and what needs to be done to reverse it.
Thank you, Anthony. And it's really welcome to be able to address the APPG, particularly on today when we are listening to the talk about the green industrial revolution. And I think I suppose I would start by welcoming the announcements that have been made today, but then, as you will hear in my 5 minutes, there are some significant caveats to make sure that they land properly. And I think that all goes to ensuring that when we look back in history, as Kate has said, around how we failed to address the nature crisis, we need to look forward about how do we tackle the climate crisis and the nature crisis as one and the same thing. We can't solve one without the other. It's not and it cannot be a question of nature or carbon. It has to be, it's in a similar way, it shouldn't be peat restoration or trees. It should be both. We need to use all of the tools, and particularly those tools that are nature-based solutions for us. And I think government has to send a very strong signal to across all of government that nature-based solutions are going to be key if we're going to meet the biodiversity targets, but also the climate change targets as well. And what was welcome also in the announcements today was this sense of landscape recovery projects, because we need landscape scale change. We need landscape scale ambition, and we need landscape scale of investment. And if we do that, I think one of the things that we avoid is this sense that in some way the environment is opposed to or a block on economic development and jobs, but also a block on the levelling up agenda. I only have to look at the Northern Forest programme that we operate with the community forests across Liverpool to Hull, and investment there of £500 million delivers 2.5 billion in benefits. And I think every opportunity should be taken in order to see that type of return on investment for society. And I think crucial to us being able to address the biodiversity decline is we have to do it with people. Often the conservation sector, of which I've been a part for over 20 years, will do it on behalf of people. I think more and increasingly the heightened awareness of the crises that we face gives us a real opportunity to build in action from people. And one of the reasons why I talk about native trees a lot, as you'd expect, but also native trees being a very powerful weapon in the fight against climate change and nature loss, is because it allows people to take an active role. One of the things that the Woodland Trust has done and announced through our Big Climate Fight Back activity this autumn is an emergency tree fund that takes the next step from the emergency tree plan for the welcome announcement of government of 30,000 hectares of trees. We would say, like many, they have to be the right trees, they have to be in the right place, and they have to do the right job managed in the right way. So if we get that right, I think there's a real opportunity to scale the biodiversity loss that we've seen. And within the report around the lost decade, we know, and the state of UK's nature, the biodiversity loss within woodlands has been significant, and we need to do something about that. And the first thing that we need to do is to ensure that we're protecting and restoring what are the crown jewels of our natural heritage, which is ancient woodlands. And that's why I say, when we're looking at how do we address the issues going forward, across government, we need to make sure that those decisions taken are in line with protecting that natural heritage. So, for example, the planning reforms that we're seeing at the moment, we know that they are very deficient in their ability to deliver and protect something which is as rich as ancient woodland and irreplaceable, given that the planning scheme is the first and last line of defence of something, which is so valuable to all of society. So if we protect and we restore well and we create well, we have a really good opportunity to address biodiversity decline. But when you put that into the context of poorly planned or poorly executed infrastructure with the potential for £27 billion on roads, what we're seeing with HS2, there's a real risk that actually the balance hasn't been shifted enough at the moment, and we're relying too much on a small amount of money in order to make a big difference. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Darren. Can I just ask one supplementary before we come to Rob Cathcart? Is the government is committed to this target of 30,000 hectares, I think it is, of trees a year. What is needed from your point of view to increase tree planting in the UK? You mentioned quite a lot about the slowing down destruction, as it were. Is it just a question of money, which is obviously a very big question, but or there are other factors?
I think we need investment and smart investment, particularly in jobs around the growing of the trees. One of the key areas for protecting is to ensure that we're not importing huge numbers of trees to meet, an arbitrary target. We operate something called UK and Irish sourced and grown, which means every tree that we will plant and the 50 million that we'll do in the next 5 years will all have been within these shores. And that's primarily to protect against imported pests and diseases. We've seen that can help to support the nursery sector, create jobs, build rural economies, but also it makes sure that we don't knock out our existing woods and tree stock. So through things like ash dieback, that could cost us all around £15 billion and the death of 120 million ash trees. Okay,
thank you. So thank you very much for that overview. So now coming to Rob Cathcart, who, as I said at the beginning, is Principal Advisor on Biodiversity for Natural England, which is the government body responsible for helping preserve and restore the natural environment. And he's been very involved with advising governments on its different biodiversity policies. So, Rob, how bad are things and how are they going to get better?
Thanks, Anthony, and good morning, everybody. Well, we've already heard from Darren and Kate that the key challenges in recovering nature, both globally and domestically, are all about protecting and restoring ecosystems at sufficient scale and mobilising the necessary resources to do that. And I think that's right. So I'll kind of develop those themes, but hopefully look a bit more at some of the detailed initiatives that we need to take to try and do that. So to set us on a path of nature recovery in England, we need transformative change, the step change in conservation that Sir John Lawton advocated more than a decade ago now. And we believe at Nature England that this transformation is indeed in reach if we realise the exciting opportunities that are now before us, notably the prospect of a new framework for nature recovery provided by a nature recovery network, local nature recovery strategies, and an innovative environmental land management scheme which is very focused on environmental outcomes. The task really is to ensure that all these elements add up to a coherent and effective national programme, costed and adequately resourced, that involves landowners and partners in planning and delivering land use change at a significant scale. And that's the key point really. Nature recovery and nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation require land use change on a scale that is transformative. And how we implement the UK's commitment to the CBD 30 by 30 target, 30% of land and seas protected by 2030, will be an acid test of that ambition. It should lead us, as Kate's already said, to implement, to review and improve the effectiveness of protected areas and other area-based conservation measures, and crucially drive habitat restoration through the nature recovery network and large landscape scale nature recovery areas. The Prime Minister's announcement of 10 landscape recovery projects, new national parks and AONBs, and the £40 million additional to the Green Recovery Challenge Fund are very welcome. Of course they are, but we are in this for the long haul, and nature recovery will need a sustained programme and long-term investment, just like we're putting into place for the net zero commitment. So we don't underestimate this challenge. It's clear, as Kate said, that the HE targets for biodiversity and people will be missed. The collective resources have been insufficient and national actions have not combined to deliver global targets. So we've now got 1 million species globally that are at risk of extinction, and only 15% of land and 7% of seas are effectively protected. The draft CBD targets for the next 10 years to replace the HE targets, including that Keystone 30 by 30 target, set up a new level of ambition. And in order to secure more effective delivery this time around, new exacting requirements are also proposed on resource mobilisation and for national biodiversity strategies to be more closely aligned with those CBD targets, and for them to contain explicit financing plans too. All developments that we would really welcome, and which will help really bolster delivery domestically and internationally. But we'd also like to see the UK government take a lead in pressing for adoption of mechanisms like the nationally determined contributions, the pledges on action by signatories to the Paris Climate Agreement, to be introduced for the CBD Global Biodiversity Framework from next year. At home, we mirror really in our delivery of the Biodiversity 2020 commitments, the current programme, the limited progress that's been achieved internationally. So we've managed to maintain management on existing wildlife rich areas, principally through agri-environment support, and we've created over 120,000 hectares of habitat restored or created. But sites of special scientific interest have not seen the improvements that they need, and only 38% of our protected sites by area are in favourable condition, and that figure hasn't really moved for more than a decade now. There have been individual species success stories like bittern and seal bunting, but long-term declines are still being recorded for priority species and for widespread groups such as breeding farmland birds and woodland birds. And 10 of our 44 British native mammals are at threat of extinction, so nearly a quarter under threat of extinction. So at Natural England, we think we need to give species particular attention over and above the kind of generic land management measures that come through agri-environment schemes. And we'd like to see a national action plan for species recovery to set out a long-term strategy, including for reintroductions and to mobilise resources. So, but fundamentally, there's been little progress in restoring ecosystems at scale and establishing a bigger and better connected network of habitats across the landscape. These are two fundamental HE and Biodiversity 2020 targets that we haven't delivered at home. So we need to remember that the Lawton report of a decade ago was really an audit of our wildlife resources, and it made clear that there is insufficient habitat to maintain sustainable species populations and the ecosystem services that society needs. So the long-term success of the Nature Recovery Network, generating habitats, nature-based solutions and green space for people has to be our priority, our central priority. But this ambitious national network will only be built if it's part of an integrated national and local programme for nature recovery. Local nature recovery strategies developed collaboratively should provide a much needed local tier of spatially intelligent planning for the natural environment, identifying local priorities and supporting the development of the network. But they also need to contribute to statutory biodiversity targets in the forthcoming Environment Act and strategic objectives in the new nature plan that will replace Biodiversity 2020. We were asked as panelists to consider how parliamentarians can best support nature recovery policy going forward. And I think the priority has got to be scrutiny to ensure that government puts in place all the elements of a coherent nature recovery programme. So do the bill provisions, targets, new duties, strategies, mapping, reporting, do they all work together to provide the local tier of planning for nature recovery that we need as part of a national cogent programme? Are we investing in an adequate framework of monitoring and evaluation? It's badly needed for treble SIs, but is also needed for the wider environment and ecosystems too. And are we getting the right kind of delivery mechanisms put into place, providing flexible and complementary funding streams for land managers that are very accessible at local level? Can ELM support landscape scale delivery at the scale that we've been talking about? And crucially, will incentives for land managers be enough to secure the 500,000 hectares of habitat restored and created that's a commitment in the 25-year environment plan? And finally, is the funding for more sources adequate? Investment in environmental land management needs to rise to about £1 billion a year by our calculation and the calculation of others. And in 2018-19, agri-environment spend was just at £365 million a year. So there's a lot we have to do. There are some exciting new initiatives in train. We need to make sure that they come together to form that effective national and local programme for nature recovery, something that's currently missing. And we need to make sure that we can mobilise resource to make it all happen.
Excellent, Rob. Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation. Questions are starting to come through. As I say, if you've got a question, please do put it on the list. I've got one question actually directly from an MP, Kate, is whether you can share your presentation afterwards with participants. I assume that's okay.
Yep, absolutely.
So we'll send that around to participants afterwards. Can I just, before we come to the questions that people are asking, I've just got one follow-up question from Rob, which you touched on there, but really it's the challenge that Kate made about the 30% protected by 2030. And Kate mentioned that many of the so-called protected areas aren't that protected, and I think you said only 5% are really properly protected. Actually, my wife's Canadian, and she sort of rather laughs at English national parks, because in Canada the national parks are proper wildernesses, and when she started coming around the national parks here, she couldn't believe that not only were there towns in them, but actually there are house building programs. I mean, limited, but it does happen. How can you make sure that the 30% protected by 2030 is a robust, a really robust measure and does really help protect biodiversity?
DEFRA is embarking on a consultative exercise on the options for doing this. So we don't want to kind of prejudge that. But I mean, in Natural England, we're very committed to a twin track approach, really. I mean, let's not downplay the importance of national parks and ONBs, and let's try and use the 30 by 30 target as a way of bolstering their contribution. That's absolutely right. But we do have to bear in mind that only 44% of the area of national parks and ONBs is actually natural habitat. And the 30 by 30 target requires us to have a focus on areas that are important for biodiversity, and to make sure that they are adequately protected and managed as part of a series of protected areas or other area-based conservation measures, as the language has it in the draft target. So what we need to do is we need to think really about not just national parks and ONBs, but other forms of provision like local nature reserves, local wildlife sites, community forests, a whole host of landscape designations, and to test whether they meet the international criteria for protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. If they don't meet those tests, what can we do to try and improve their provision of for conservation management, for helping to restore and create new habitat? I mean, at the heart of all this, again, has got to be the nature recovery network and nature recovery areas. And we think we should be looking to use the 30 by 30 target as a driver, as underpinning for really reinforcing the need to develop the network, creating habitat, restoring natural ecosystem function, and then we're moving over time towards a more meaningful implementation of that international 30 by 30 target.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The first question we have on the chat is about peatlands, and why are we not restoring peatlands? Is it too difficult or too expensive? So this is really the argument sort of for and against it. I'm conscious that Rob's just an advisor to government rather than a spokesman for government, but just interested, I mean, Kate or Darren, if you've got views on arguments about peatland and why they should be restored, and Rob, if you have any views.
Yeah, I'll happily come in here. So I mean, why are we not restoring them? Well, the truth is we're currently doing exactly the opposite to them. So we're still draining them, we're still overgrazing them, and critically, we're still setting fire to them, primarily to support intensive driven grouse moor shooting. And bogs, if they need anything, they need water, they don't need fire. So I said 75% of our bogs are degraded. In the last 30 years, 3 to 4% have been restored. Now, we know how to do this. There are some great partnerships, many of them in our national parks and AONBs doing them, RSPB leading some, participating in others. So we absolutely can do this. This is a political will issue, basically. It is expensive, but it is nothing like, the cost benefit analysis for what you get back. Then the economic argument is entirely in favour of their restoration, and that's about carbon sequestration. It's about biodiversity enhancement. It's also about things like flood alleviation, because our degraded uplands are part of the reason that we're seeing such terrible flooding, particularly in upland catchments, because degraded bogs don't hold water, and holding water is what they ought to do. So I mean, the really obvious political things here are around banning burning. on peatlands, something Zach Goldsmith, I think yesterday, restated his commitment to, but we have yet to see anything from government. And also we need to stop selling it in bags to gardeners, because we're still harvesting peat for horticultural use. And you know, that's madness. So yeah, why aren't we restoring them? Because so far there hasn't been the political will to make that happen.
Thanks. Darren or Rob, do you have comments on peatlands? I see Sarah Dines has her hand up as well. I'll come to you afterwards, Sarah. So Darren.
Yeah, yes. I suppose as an organisation that also manages peat bogs on a number of our sites, I think what we found is, as Kate says, the solution is there. It's the willingness to bring together the management of those peat bogs in relation to the wider landscape as well, to get the full benefits. And whilst the operations may be expensive, I think the payback, similar to in how we view, you know, the use of native trees, the payback comes a multiple greater. And the problem is that multiple up until now hasn't really had a commercial price, which has then driven the management in commercial operations, when Kate's talking about the horticultural sector, to make the shift. And that's where I think we do need the political will to change the dynamic there.
If I just come in very quickly, Anthony, I mean, it's an absolute imperative to restore peatlands, you know, for climate change reasons alone. And the Climate Change Committee and its recommendations on restoring peatland and stopping burning, you know, were very clear. I mean, the government is taking initiatives, and there is a peat fund supporting projects at the moment, but we are expecting a peat strategy to be published hopefully very shortly, and it will be interesting to see whether the commitment there, you know, reflects the Climate Change Committee's ambitions and previous statements by ministers. You know, we do need urgent action, and we need to restore our peatlands, you know, alongside a programme of appropriate tree planting and also coastal habitat restoration, all of which can contribute massively to carbon sequestration.
Excellent, thank you very much. Sarah Dines, who's MP for Derbyshire Dales, with a lot of peat in it, I'm assuming, had her hand up. Sarah, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I did, very briefly. Can you hear me all right? Because I'm having
Absolutely.
problems with the connection.
Yeah, can do. Can't see you, but can hear you.
Thank you. Well, as Andrew mentioned, I'm the UMP for the Derbyshire Dales, which has a large chunk of the Peat District in it. I just wanted to put the record straight in that I've been up and visited and worked with Moors for the Future Partnership, which is upland moorland, and there is a huge amount of work being done. So it's not really quite right to say that very little is being done for the uplands to preserve them. There is a lot of work being done to assist with flood prevention, but also general biodiversity. I think we must be really careful not to get dragged into an argument that we must stop shooting, hunting and fishing. We've got to balance everything together. But the Moors for the Future Partnership are doing fantastic work, and I'd like to see that rolled out more. It's reversing the difficulties we've had with industrial pollution over the centuries, and we can do it. They've done fantastic work with relatively modest investment. So I'd really like to push that forward. Thank you.
Yeah,
and that's great. Does anybody want to come back on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to say, so absolutely. I mean, Moors for the Future are doing great work, and that's one of the partnerships that I mentioned, who are illustrating exactly how this can be done. But the issue remains that's been achieved over about 3% of our peatlands, and 75% remain degraded. So I'm absolutely with Sarah on the value of their work, and my message is about the need to roll that out much wider.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question from my neighbouring MP, Daniel Zeichler, in the chat, MP for Cambridge, who's also on the Environment Bill Committee with me. We're spending a lot of time together at the moment. Daniel, I don't know if you want to ask your question, or should I just read it out?
Well, I'm quite happy to put the question, Andy. Yeah, I mean, we talked about tree planting targets, and obviously it's in the 10-point plan that the Prime Minister's announced. But the truth is, we're way falling short of meeting those targets. So whilst it's fine for the political party to have a kind of an auction on who can make the biggest numbers in terms of targets, the key is, why aren't we being able to meet them?
I can
Darren, do you want to come to that first, then maybe?
Yeah, you'd imagine I'd have a view on that.
Yeah.
I think it's a great point, Daniel. I think there are a few things which are at play here which are stopping us currently meeting that target. I mentioned tree stock, and we need to build that up in order to make sure that it's a secure stock of the right trees in order to be able to get out into the landscape. I think there is a cultural issue and a political barrier around some of the schemes that we currently have, which don't look at trees, for example, on farms being the positive things that they are. So I know we're looking at test and trial for things like agroforestry, so that we're working with people like the Soil Association to integrate trees into working farming systems, because the cultural barrier is often coined as being kind of farmers look down and foresters look up, and therefore they're not looking in the same directions. I think there's a coming together now, which gives us a real opportunity to look at the landscape and give people options about how do they change the nature of how we manage land in order to unlock the land that we're going to need for 30,000 hectares a year. And I think the other thing around what I was saying in my presentation about with people, I think there's a real opportunity with lots of local authorities and local decision makers whose areas have defined climate emergencies, to look at where they can play a really key role in getting their constituents out to play an active role in tackling the nature and climate crisis through engaging in establishing new woodlands, which will be good for nature, good for carbon, and good for people's health and well-being. And I think if we bring all of those tools to bear with things like elms, but also the business community, then I think we'll have the resources and the space in order to do it.
Does Rob or Kate want to add anything while we're missing on our tree targets?
Nothing to add to what Darren said from me.
I suppose just very quickly to re-emphasise the point that Darren made about incentives, really, and about having an elm scheme, because it is going to be the primary kind of delivery mechanism. Having an elm scheme that's designed in such a way that current barriers to tree planting, but to other forms of land use change too, are removed. But I think getting the incentives right is absolutely essential. I mean, we're not short of ambition in terms of the 25-year environment plan and the tree strategy. The scale of land use change that's envisaged is huge, but there's still a question mark, I think, about the resource and the mechanisms being in place to actually deliver that. You know, we've got to find solutions that work for land managers, farmers, and for their businesses too, in order to make all of this happen.
I think, Anthony, if it's okay, I could just come back on two very specific things. One is, I think, what elms can play a really crucial role in being the provider of the resources that help people to transition to a new place. But I think one of the things that we are recognising, and I think that is across the farming community, is that having trees on their land is actually helping their productivity. So it's not a how am I going to diminish my kind of food production capacity and turn into a forester rather than a farmer. So I think elms has a really good role to play in that, but it also has a role to recognise the fact that natural regeneration, currently not supported as a mechanism for establishing trees, which doesn't need nurseries to grow it, means that actually there is a disincentive there. And I think what could be really helpful is to have elms recognising that, as it is in other parts of the UK, that natural regeneration has a role to play in supporting farmers' integration of trees on their land.
Yeah, no, I personally fully support that about elms. I think we should probably do an event specifically on elms with the minister at some point. We do have an event on the tree strategy generally with Zach Goldsmith. I think not until January. We've got a long question from Gareth Morgan at the Soil Association, who I can see sitting in front of his staircase there. I don't know if you want to ask it orally, verbally, Gareth.
Yeah, I'll try and summarise it. I just want to make sure we keep attention on the wider countryside in this. I feel a sense of retreat around this 30% figure and into nature reserves and into SSSIs. I mean, that should be taken as read, but we're not going to get to 30% with those classifications. And we've somehow got to get productive farmland and forestry included in that sense of nature first alongside production land. And I feel Elms is going the wrong way on that, in the sense it seems to be getting less ambitious around tier 1, which is the way in which we want to get farming into a place where it's actually delivering nature outcomes as part of what it's doing. And I just wonder who's left championing that agenda at the moment. I feel Natural England is under pressure with its resources, and the NGOs seem to be more and more focused on protected sites. How do we get back into that sort of broader agenda on this, do you think?
That's a very good question. Kate, Darren, Rob, who has a view on this?
Yeah.
Want to go first, Darren?
Kate, do you want to go first, then Darren, then Rob?
Yeah, so I think it's a good point. I mean, I think there is a real risk that with that great and ambitious target, people feel like that's it, and it can't be it. So you know, we know that we need to restore nature across the UK. We need that from a nature point of view. We need the important places for nature to be protected. We also need it from a people point of view, because if COVID's taught us anything, it's about the value of nature to people in their everyday lives and the importance of making sure that the nature are in the same places as the people. So I think we absolutely need a kind of a solid core of that 30% of land where nature is the primary focus, but that absolutely can't be the end of it. And I think your Elms question is key, because is there the appetite, and will that be translated into the money to properly fund the higher tiers of elms so that they don't just get sucked into protected sites? We absolutely need them outside. And just from an ecological point of view, you know, protected sites don't work in a wider denuded landscape, and we won't restore a wider denuded landscape if we don't have healthy protected sites from which to restore it. So yeah, we've absolutely got to keep that focus on the need for nature recovery across the UK with a protected sites network at its core, where nature comes first, but also integrating nature into that wider landscape. Farmers will be key, and the extent to which Elms does or does not support that ambition will be key. And that's really about both how the 3 tiers of Elms, which is the environmental land management scheme, are designed, but also how that funding is allocated across those 3 tiers. If we're going to make a real difference, then the bulk of that money has to go to the higher tiers that deliver more.
Yeah.
So to Darren first, then Rob.
Yeah. So just building on what Kate said, I think there are 2 elements for me in this. One is a social justice element, which I think Kate touched upon, but it's, you know, we all know and we all benefit from nature, and therefore there is a social justice element to that wider landscape, that everybody should have that benefit and be able to achieve that. And we've seen, you know, we have over 1,000 woods across the UK, all free to access regardless of membership. And that's really at its heart, recognising the fact that nobody should be excluded from really special places. I think the point around the wider landscape, I think, is a limited resource issue. What happens obviously is people start to prioritise when you don't have enough resource to do the full job. And we've seen with the very welcome 40 million announcement this week, that when the previous 40 million was announced, there was a pot of shovel-ready projects to deliver nature across England, and that had a bill that was 7 to 10 times that amount. So it just shows the fact that the work to be done needs to be and have the resources in order for it to be able to spread well across the wider landscape for that social justice element. And then I would go back to the point I made at the start, which is all parts of government and policies have to then help nature rather than potentially hinder them. And the example I gave around planning reform is key to that. That will protect, from a woods and trees perspective, you know, it is the first and last line of defence for our woods and trees in that wider landscape. If we lose that, which we are at risk of doing, then actually it makes it incredibly difficult to provide that social justice.
Thank you. So Rob, how do we ensure nature more broadly outside protected sites is helped?
Well, I have a long-standing policy of always agreeing with Gareth. Hello, Gareth. So he makes a very important point, really. I mean, I would point to the Nature Recovery Network as part of the solution here, which isn't just about protected sites. It's about creating wildlife-rich areas and areas that are more sustainable for wildlife across the broader landscape. And we need locally to get support for a growing nature recovery network, not just from land managers and farmers, but from local communities too. The nature recovery network needs to be both an urban or peri-urban feature of the landscape, as well as a rural network. So providing that kind of green space is important too. But I think we need to think about how the network is supported in the agricultural landscape, especially in the lowlands. So how can we design an elm scheme that's properly weighted in terms of its tiers, so that it makes a contribution across the broader landscape, but then also in a more focused way to the nature recovery network. And we are doing some thinking with DEFRA about what nature recovery farms might look like in future. And as I say, that isn't about protected sites. That's about trying to build in meaningful biodiversity gain into the agricultural landscape through a variety of different ways.
Excellent, thank you, Rob. I've got a question from Jerome Mayhew, who's the MP for Broadlands and Norfolk. I don't know, Jerome, do you want to ask your questions about trees?
Yeah, thanks. Well, that's a great loss to everyone, I'm sure. I'm just building on this point, which is we shouldn't be retreating into a series of nature reserves, but given that the agricultural landscape is well over 70%, I think it's 76% of our landmass, we're only going to get really serious about biodiversity recovery if we integrate it harmoniously within the agricultural environment. So on that point, I want to pick up what Darren Moorcroft said about trees actually increasing productivity. I'm surprised by that, given my observation as a sort of semi-farmer, and I'd just like to understand more why you make that assertion that trees can increase productivity in an agricultural environment. And secondly, it's worth pointing out, as the NFU does, that for farmers, their land is their only asset, their only productive asset. So if you want to get them to plant trees, what you're really asking them to do is permanently to remove their only asset from their productive economy. And given our approach to tree planting and also our approach to scrubbing forestry once you've planted it, it's essentially a removal in perpetuity of their primary productive asset. So how do you address that to make it in the farmer's long-term in perpetuity interest to grow trees as opposed to other productive use of their land?
Okay.
Very good question. Darren.
Yeah, thank you, Jerome. And I suppose I'll answer this from a historical basis of having managed an arable farm in the past. I'll give you two very quick examples. The first is from an arable system in which we see agroforestry being integrated into the arable fields in the east of England, in your neck of the woods. And what that does is it changes the nature of the productive area of a farm, because it goes further up into the airspace and deeper into the root system and into the soil system. And in doing so, it means that for the small areas of land that you would take out and plant rows of trees in which you would then grow your cereals productivity is supported. It might drop by about sort of 10%. To 10 to 20%, but you get 40% productivity from the trees in terms of commercial commodity crops. So your overall productivity for the area of land is 120% of what it was previously. It does take you do need to be able to manage those things, and I think it goes back to my point around cultural challenges. The second one is from the livestock sector, where we've got farmers up in the hills in Cumbria, and they're using trees in order to provide the shade and shelter that will help their livestock, particularly sheep, to maintain and increase their dry weights. So again, it's producing increased productivity. So it's about the integration of trees into many of our farming systems. So not necessarily just wholesale shift from farming system to forestry. One of our big challenges, I think, for biodiversity and for the landscape is so-called trees outside woods. We need to have those trees that connect through the landscape in a much more overt and clear way. And we know that those individual trees in hedgerows, for example, will lock up more carbon than a tree that's in itself in a wood. So there are multiple benefits.
And Jerome's point about the locking up the asset in perpetuity, presumably you would answer that by saying, well, it increases productivity, but presumably the comeback to that is that there'll be limits to this, in the sense you couldn't cover the whole farm with trees, obviously. But is that, how do you persuade farmers long term to plant trees?
I think the big barrier potentially at the moment has always been the BPS scheme and the subsidy system, which has meant that you would automatically lose money that you would get from the taxpayer if you planted trees on land that you would otherwise produce another crop. I think the shift that we will hopefully see with the agriculture bill and the public money for public goods, I think that can change the dynamic now, so that it's no longer a long-term barrier to integration of trees. And some farmers, we have conversations with, are looking to shift the way in which they manage whole farms by putting trees on them, and looking at how they can use that as a mechanism to bring a regular income onto the farm, and in some cases help them to change the nature of their kind of lifestyle.
Okay, thank you. I think Kate wants to come in. Then we've got time for one more question, which will be from Robin McGee, which is put in the chat. But Kate, and Rob might want to come up back on this one. But if it's short answers, please, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, sure. So absolutely agree with everything Darren said about trees in landscape, as much as kind of forestry approach to tree planting. And I just really wanted to flag the Nature Friendly Farming Network, which is a coming together of farmers who, off their own backs, are looking at how they restore biodiversity, restore soil condition, because they are finding that working with nature rather than against it is better for their bottom line. And some of them are doing it in what would traditionally be called less favoured areas, places like the Lake District, so people like James Rebanks. Some of them, like Martin Lines, are doing it in the kind of commercial arable.
In my constituency, and I've visited his farm.
So yeah, just following the Nature Friendly Farming Network and seeing what those guys are doing, I think that shows exactly what can be achieved, and from a farmer-led perspective, which is vital, I think.
Rob, do you want to come on back on this point about trees? You okay?
No, nothing to add. Okay,
so last question from Robin McGee. Robin, I don't know if you want to ask it. I can see you there. Whether you want to ask it verbally, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So,
World Wildlife Fund.
Yeah, that's right, from WWF. So we've seen the 10-point plan, and as we've discussed today, it's ambitious, but we need to see more on biodiversity specifically. And I'm interested in what the panel thinks about how the UK should connect the two COPs next year, so the COP15 UN Biodiversity Conference, and of course the COP26 Climate Conference.
So Kate had her hand up first, then Rob, and then Darren.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the obvious thing here is that it is amazing that nature is the theme of the climate conference. So that conference is set up to have a really clear-eyed focus on nature-based solutions to climate change. And I think we need to exploit that opportunity, and as host of the climate conference, maximize that opportunity to its maximum potential. So whether we're talking about woodlands or peatlands, whether we're talking about the value of recovering protected areas and the wider landscape in terms of carbon sequestration, there are these massive overlaps, and the fact that these conferences come together and the fact that the climate one focuses on nature, I think just is absolutely the perfect opportunity.
Darren, then Rob. Do you want to come on this, Darren?
Yeah, yes, please. So I think as Kate said, I think we have nature-based solutions which are feeding into both of those COPs really strongly. And as was said at the start, the the rhetoric has to turn into reality, and for us to show leadership through demonstrating that we're making a difference. And when people talk about dealing with the climate crisis on an international scale, they often talk about the Amazon. And I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to look at home and say, actually, our version of the Amazon is the Scottish rainforests, which are internationally important. They hold internationally important biodiversity. They can hold internationally important levels of carbon. And I think we have to get that kind of scale of restoration in place in order for us to be able to say to others, they need to play their part. And in doing so, I think we bring the two things together with reality of our leadership being born out of practice as well as policy.
Rob, how do we bring the COPs together?
Yeah, I agree with all that's just been said, really. I mentioned at the top of the meeting the idea for nationally determined contributions, these pledges that signatories make under the Paris Agreement. Wouldn't it be great to do something similar for the biodiversity COP2? So, the UK government brings biodiversity commitments, things that he's going to do at home to address nature recovery and nature-based solutions. So the twin biodiversity and climate crises through land management and land use change. That would be fantastic. I mean, the 30 by 30 commitment is a step along the road. We need to still, as we've already said, we need to still see what that will mean domestically in terms of how we're going to deploy it at home. But those, a set of twin commitments, a set of twin pledges on nature recovery and climate would be a way of showing leadership at both COPs, I think.
No, I personally think that's an excellent idea. Before I say thank you to everyone, we have run out of time. I should point out that we've actually got two events on the COPs. We've got on the 27th of November with the Green Alliance. We've got a meeting with Alok Sharma about it's a whole day conference, but about 2021, a year of leadership on climate and nature. And then we've got an APPG event on the 7th of December with Alok Sharma to talk specifically about COP26 and his ambitions for that. And then we've got a trees thing with Zach Goldsmith, the trees minister, on the 12th of January, and an event on internal combustion engine, phasing them out. That should be next week. But thank you everyone for coming. We'll circulate Kate Jennings' slides to participants afterwards, and see you again soon. Thank you for your time and support.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.